November 14, 1984, at 3:17 in the morning at Schriever Air Force Base, Colorado Springs. The sodium vapor lights cast everything in a sick yellow. William Campiles had been out of the game for 6 years. However, he knew that specific color. It was the color of classified facilities after midnight, when the real work happened. Inside Consolidated Space Operations Center's Building 45, a camera shutter clicked 3 times in rapid succession. This was past cipher-locked doors. Biometric scanners, unknown to the public for another 10 years, also guarded the entrance. The sound was impossibly loud in the silence between the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system cycles. The air tasted like ozone and fear. Christopher Boyce had been different. He was an idealist who sold secrets to damage a system he despised. Samuel Loring Morrison had been desperate, trying to impress Jane's Defense Weekly with satellite photos of Soviet shipyards. However, the man standing in front of Satellite Communication Terminal 7 was different. He used a 2-inch lens. TRX classified technical manuals were spread across a light table. He was not driven by ideology or desperation. Counterintelligence specialists at Bolling Air Force Base later described his motivation. Their damage assessment report, designated CI 844472, cited catastrophic financial incompetence. It also described functional sociopathy. His name was William Bell. He worked for Hughes Aircraft Company. His security clearance gave him access to everything the United States knew about how to hide satellites from Soviet detection. His cocaine dealer was a 31-year-old former used car salesman named Marian Zakarski. Zakarski worked for Polish intelligence. He served as an officer in the Wydział Wywiadowczy. He answered directly to the KGB's first chief directorate. The camera clicked again. The documents in frame contained orbital parameters and radar cross-section data. They also detailed something called Project 1113 Stealth Satellite Initiative. This program was so classified that its code name was also a secret. Outside, the prairie wind pushed tumbleweeds against the perimeter fence. The temperature was dropping toward 18 degrees. In 6 hours, the day shift would arrive. They would lock their classified materials in General Services Administration-approved containers. They would never notice that someone had already photographed them. In 8 hours, those photographs would be on a United Airlines flight to Los Angeles. In 12 hours, they would be in a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo on Wilshire Boulevard. In 16 hours, Marian Zakarski would open that box with his duplicate key. He would transfer the film canisters to a diplomatic pouch. This would begin the process of unraveling $23 billion in American satellite technology investment, but that was still 13 hours away. Right now, in the sodium-yellow darkness of Building 45, William Bell was adjusting his exposure for the next shot. His hands were not shaking. They never did. That was the first thing the Federal Bureau of Investigation would notice later. He had absolute steadiness. This showed a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He simply did not care about anything except the $110,000 slowly accumulating in his account. The second thing they would notice was the quality of the photographs. They were professional. They were methodical. They were complete. The camera clicked again. Outside, a security patrol drove past on its scheduled rounds. Tires crunched on gravel. Inside, William Bell photographed the future of Soviet anti-satellite warfare, one perfectly focused frame at a time. The official story would eventually appear in Naval Criminal Investigative Service case file 842847. It later featured in sanitized congressional testimony. This story began with a friendship between 2 men. They met at a Los Angeles restaurant in 1979. William Bell was then 46 years old. He worked as a senior project engineer for Hughes Aircraft Company in El Segundo, California. His projects included the Evolved Defense Satellite Communications System and the Advanced Tactical Satellite Relay. His annual salary was $47,800. His annual expenses exceeded $89,000. These were driven by failed real estate speculation. His ex-wife later described his spending as pathological materialism. Marian Zakarski, then 26, presented himself as an entrepreneur representing Palamco. This was a Polish industrial trade organization with offices in a modest building on Wilshire Boulevard. He drove a silver BMW 633 CSI. He wore Brioni suits. He spoke 4 languages fluently. He could discuss orbital mechanics with casual expertise. He also brought this expertise to conversations about Southern California real estate values. He was charming in the specific way that recruitment officers are trained to be charming. He was interested without being intrusive. He was generous without being suspicious. He was always available, but never desperate. What the official story emphasized was opportunity and greed. Bell had access. Zakarsky had money. The intersection was inevitable, almost banal. During the trial in 1982, United States Attorney Robert Bonner would characterize the relationship as a simple transaction. It was between a corrupt defense contractor and a foreign agent. The jury would deliberate for 6 hours before convicting Bell on 8 counts of espionage. The judge would sentence him to 8 years in federal prison. This was a remarkably lenient sentence. Prosecutors would privately describe it as infuriating. Bell had sold information on over 12 classified satellite programs. However, what was actually at stake went far beyond William Bell's mortgage problems or Marian Zakarsky's intelligence career. In 1979, the United States maintained its strategic advantage over the Soviet Union. This was due to 3 technological superiorities. These included submarine silencing technology, integrated circuit miniaturization, and satellite reconnaissance. The first allowed American submarines to hide. The second allowed American weapons to think. The third allowed American intelligence to see. The satellites themselves represented a revolution in reconnaissance architecture. Earlier systems like Corona, Gambit, and Hexagon had been film-based platforms. These platforms dropped recovery capsules over the Pacific. The new generation used digital imaging systems with real-time transmission capabilities. More importantly, they used something called synthetic aperture radar cross-section reduction. This was a collection of design principles. It made American satellites effectively invisible to Soviet ground-based tracking systems. The technology worked through a combination of geometric shaping and radar-absorbent coatings. Hughes engineers called this signature management. A conventional satellite reflected radar like a mirror. Soviet space tracking networks could detect the return. They could calculate orbital parameters within minutes. A stealth satellite scattered radar energy in predetermined directions, reducing its effective cross-section by a factor of 10,000. To Soviet tracking stations, stealth satellites looked like cosmic background noise. They knew American reconnaissance platforms were up there, they just could not find them. This was the strategic revolution that William Bell photographed across 14 separate meetings between March 1980 and June 1981. He did not photograph the satellites themselves. He never had direct access to the physical hardware. Instead, he photographed the technical manuals, design specifications, radar absorption test data, and orbital deployment procedures. He photographed the mathematics of invisibility. The key players formed an unlikely constellation. Bell himself was professionally competent, but personally unremarkable. He was the kind of engineer who could calculate thermal dissipation rates. However, he could not balance his checkbook. His Hughes security file was later reviewed by Defense Investigative Service investigators. It showed exactly one anomaly. This was a 1976 interview. During it, he expressed an unusual interest in the monetary value of classified information. The officer recommended continued monitoring. The recommendation was filed and forgotten. Zakarsky was something else entirely. Born in 1951 in Łaziska Górne, Poland, he had been recruited by Polish intelligence while studying at the University of Poznan. His controller was a colonel named Bogdan Lewandowski. Lewandowski operated out of Warsaw's Ministry of Internal Affairs. He had identified Zakarsky as a natural for Western operations. Zakarsky was fluent in English. He was comfortable with American culture. He also possessed an easy confidence that made people want to help him. He arrived in Los Angeles in 1977 with a cover story about industrial trade and a genuine talent for making money. By 1979, Palamco was actually turning a profit on legitimate sales. The business was not merely a cover, it was camouflage. The best legends are mostly true. The third player was less visible but more significant. This was Major Yevgeny Petrov of the KGB's first Chief Directorate. He headed Directorate T, the Science and Technology Division. Petrov never met Bell. He never visited Los Angeles. But every photograph Bell took, every document he copied, and every technical specification he compromised flowed through Petrov's desk at Yasenevo, the KGB's Moscow headquarters. Petrov's job was to evaluate intelligence value and coordinate exploitation. He was, by all accounts, reviewed in declassified Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence assessments. Brilliant at it. What Moscow believed it was getting was technical intelligence on American satellite capabilities. What Washington believed it was protecting was the same thing. Both were correct, but incomplete. The real vulnerability was not what Bell was selling. It was what Soviet engineers would be able to do with the information. In March 1980, Bell delivered his first package. It contained 137 photographs of Hughes aircraft technical manuals. These were for the Defense Satellite Communications System Phase 3. At that time, Soviet space tracking capabilities were roughly equivalent to American capabilities from 1965. They could detect satellites, calculate orbits, and predict passes. However, they could not find stealth platforms. They could not predict their coverage windows. They also could not develop effective countermeasures. The photographs changed everything. Within 18 months, Soviet engineers at KBRC NAL in Leningrad developed new tracking algorithms. These were based on the signature management principles Bell had compromised. Within 3 years, they would deploy upgraded tracking stations. These could detect American stealth satellites with 70% reliability. The financial arrangements were straightforward and almost boring. Zakarsky paid Bell in cash. This was usually between $5,000 and $15,000 per meeting. The amount depended on the value of the material. The money came through diplomatic pouches from Warsaw. It was converted to dollars at Polish consulate offices. It was delivered to Bell at parking lots, restaurants, and once at a Los Angeles Dodgers game. Bell spent it immediately and poorly. He spent it on a boat he could not maintain. He also invested in real estate partnerships that collapsed. His lifestyle consistently exceeded his income. By June 1981, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested both men, Bell had received approximately $110,000. He had saved exactly none of it. The arrest itself came from a different kind of tradecraft failure. In May 1981, a Polish intelligence officer named Waldemar Gochlowski defected to the Central Intelligence Agency in West Berlin. His debriefing was conducted over 3 weeks. This took place at a safe house in Virginia. It included references to a highly productive American source. This source was run through Los Angeles by an officer using commercial cover. The Central Intelligence Agency passed the information to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Foreign Counterintelligence Division. The Federal Bureau of Investigation initiated surveillance on Zakarsky. The surveillance led to Bell. By June 28, 1981, both men were in federal custody. Neither the arrest reports nor the subsequent trial revealed the full extent of the intelligence agency's awareness. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's surveillance began in April 1981. However, National Security Agency signals intelligence analysts had flagged unusual communications. These were between the Polish consulate and Warsaw as early as January 1981. Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence officers also received early reports. These indicated a Warsaw Pact intelligence success against United States satellite programs in October 1980. The information had been filed, analyzed, and prioritized according to standard procedures. These procedures were designed to prevent premature actions that might compromise sources. This also meant Bell continued photographing classified materials for 8 months after American intelligence agencies suspected a penetration. The court proceedings were brief and oddly anticlimactic. Bell's defense attorney argued that a sophisticated foreign intelligence service had entrapped his client. The jury was not impressed. Zakarsky, defended by a different attorney, received a life sentence. His attorney argued that his client was merely a businessman caught up in circumstances beyond his control. This sentence was later reduced to 23 years. He returned to Poland in 1985 in a prisoner exchange. Bell received 8 years. He served 6 years. He was released in 1988 to a witness protection program. This program relocated him to somewhere in the Southwest. The official story of arrests, trials, and sentences unfolded in courtrooms and press conferences. However, the hidden truth was unfolding elsewhere. Counterintelligence analysts conducted a damage assessment in Building 43 at Bolling Air Force Base. Simultaneously, technical intelligence specialists conducted operational exploitation in offices at Yasenyevo. These specialists belonged to the Committee for State Security. The damage assessment began on July 2, 1981, 4 days after the arrests. Colonel Thomas Ward, a career Air Force counterintelligence officer, was the lead investigator. He worked with a team from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Science and Technology. Their assignment was to determine exactly what Bell had compromised. They also assessed what Soviet intelligence could do with the information. The problem was documentation. Bell had not kept records. He photographed whatever looked valuable. Then he delivered the film to Tsar-Ski and spent the money. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had recovered some materials from Tsar-Ski's office. These included 3 undeveloped film canisters containing photographs of Hughes' technical manuals. However, most of what Bell had delivered over 14 months was already in Moscow. Ward's team reconstructed the compromise by examining Bell's work assignments. They also reviewed his facility access logs and the materials he had been authorized to review. The reconstruction took 9 weeks. The classified final report was completed in September 1981. It was partially declassified in 2007 as document CIDR 814472. This report identified compromises in 12 separate satellite programs. Compromises included orbital parameters, transmission frequencies, and encryption architecture for the Defense Satellite Communications System Phase 3. Advanced tactical satellite relay specifications were also compromised. Additionally, radar cross-section reduction principles for the Evolved Defense Satellite Communications System were exposed. Project 1113 Stealth Satellite Initiative design principles were also revealed. Operational procedures for the KH-11. Kennan electro-optical reconnaissance platform were compromised to a limited extent. Chalet Signals intelligence satellite orbital deployment schedules were also exposed. Technical specifications for the satellite data system relay network were revealed. Navigation signal architecture for the Global Positioning System, Block 2, was likewise compromised. Sensor specifications for Defense Support Program missile warning satellites were included. Preliminary design concepts for the Milstar communications constellation were also compromised. Furthermore, 2 additional programs had their names redacted. These names remained redacted even in the 2007 declassification. The list of compromises was devastating. Bell had not just compromised individual satellites, he had compromised the design principles that made American satellite reconnaissance possible. The radar cross-section data alone would allow Soviet engineers to redesign their tracking systems. The orbital parameters would allow Soviet military planners to predict coverage gaps. The encryption architecture would allow Soviet signals intelligence to target American military communications. However, the most significant compromise involved the signature management principles for stealth satellites. This would reshape Cold War satellite operations for the next decade. The principles themselves were mathematically complex but conceptually straightforward. A satellite's radar cross-section could be reduced by shaping its surfaces to deflect radar energy, coating them with radar-absorbent materials, and minimizing reflective components. These specific techniques represented years of research and billions of dollars in development. Bell had photographed all of it, capturing 53 pages of technical specifications. These included radar absorption coefficients, geometric shaping principles, and material composition data. The photographs were sharp, well-lit, and professionally composed. Soviet engineers would not need to reverse engineer American technology. They could simply read the manual. The exploitation began at KGB Arsenal. This Soviet Space Systems Design Bureau in Leningrad specialized in reconnaissance and targeting satellites. The technical intelligence reached KGB Arsenal in August 1980, approximately 4 months after Bell's first delivery. The chief designer was a rocket engineer named Vladimir Polyakov. He had worked on early Soviet space tracking systems and recognized immediately what he was seeing. Polyakov's team began by validating the intelligence. They compared Bell's photographs to their own observations of American satellite behavior. The correlation was perfect. American satellites that Soviet tracking stations had previously been unable to locate matched exactly the signature management profiles in the Hughes documents. The intelligence was not disinformation, it was real. The second phase was adaptation. Soviet engineers could not simply copy American techniques. Soviet industrial capabilities particularly in advanced materials and precision manufacturing, lagged American capabilities by approximately 15 years. However, they could use American design principles to develop countermeasures. If they understood how American satellites scattered radar energy, they could design tracking systems that looked for those specific scatter patterns. The result was a new generation of Soviet space surveillance radars, designated 45ZH6KROH-NA. They began deployment in 1983 at facilities near Nakhabino and Krasnoyarsk. These systems used correlation tracking. This meant they looked for patterns in background noise instead of direct radar returns. The technique was mathematically intensive, requiring computational capabilities that Soviet systems barely possessed. However, it worked. By 1984, Soviet space tracking networks could locate American stealth satellites with approximately 70% reliability. This was sufficient to track orbital patterns and predict coverage windows. The strategic implications rippled outward. American satellite reconnaissance depended on the assumption that Soviet forces could not predict when they were being observed. That assumption shaped everything from naval operations to arms control treaty compliance. If Soviet forces could predict coverage windows, they could conceal activities during observation periods. The entire architecture of American strategic intelligence was suddenly vulnerable. However, the vulnerability had a mirror image. The Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Strategic Research completed a classified assessment in March 1982. It concluded that Soviet knowledge of American satellite capabilities would force Moscow to assume maximum American intelligence penetration. If they knew American satellites could read PREK-VDA headlines from orbit, they would assume those satellites were watching everything. This paranoia would be operationally costly, requiring more camouflage, deception, and resources for concealment. The assessment concluded the compromise was severe. However, it was potentially manageable if American intelligence monitored Soviet countermeasure development. That monitoring fell to the National Reconnaissance Office. This office worked with signals intelligence from the National Security Agency and human intelligence from the Central Intelligence Agency. The challenge was technical. How could they spy on how the enemy was using stolen secrets to spy on them? The solution was multi-layered. The National Security Agency monitored communications between Soviet space tracking facilities, looking for references to successful detections. Central Intelligence Agency officers in Moscow and Leningrad recruited sources with access to space program information. Furthermore, the National Reconnaissance Office began deploying new satellites with updated signature management. This was essentially an arms race in invisibility. The human chess game between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Committee for State Security played out in more direct ways. Within 6 weeks of Bell's arrest, Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence officers had identified 3 Soviet intelligence officers in the United States. These officers had operational connections to technical intelligence collection. All 3 were declared persona non grata and then expelled. The expulsions were carefully calibrated, significant enough to demonstrate American seriousness, yet limited enough to avoid broader retaliation. Moscow's response was precise and symbolic. In August 1981, 2 Central Intelligence Agency officers working under diplomatic cover in Warsaw were arrested on fabricated charges. They were held for 72 hours and then expelled. The message was clear. Moscow acknowledged the operation had been caught, but the intelligence game would continue. The game's continuation involved what intelligence professionals call loss mitigation. Once a compromise is discovered, both sides race to minimize damage and maximize advantage. For the Americans, this meant accelerating new satellite deployments with updated signature management techniques. The National Reconnaissance Office's classified budget for fiscal year 1983 included $847 million in capability restoration. This was a euphemism for rebuilding what Bell had compromised. For the Soviets, loss mitigation meant protecting their new tracking capabilities. If the Americans knew that Moscow had developed effective countermeasures, American engineers would redesign satellite signatures. The solution was operational security. Soviet space tracking facilities continued to behave as if they could not detect stealth satellites. They did not adjust their tracking patterns. They did not alert military forces to satellite coverage windows. The new capabilities remained hidden, held in reserve for a crisis when surprise would matter more than routine exploitation. The deepest irony, which would not become apparent until years later, was that both sides were running parallel deception operations based on the same compromise. American intelligence knew the Soviets had obtained design specifications. Soviet intelligence knew the Americans knew. However, neither side was certain what the other side was doing with that knowledge. The result was a hall of mirrors. Each side's uncertainty forced conservative assumptions that partially negated the intelligence advantage. This dynamic was clearest in satellite deployment patterns. Between 1982 and 1985, the United States launched 17 new reconnaissance satellites. 8 used updated signature management techniques. These were designed to defeat the tracking capabilities Soviet engineers developed from Bell's photographs. 9 used deliberately outdated techniques. These decoys were designed to waste Soviet tracking resources. The Soviets could not distinguish between real targets and decoys without revealing their own tracking capabilities. Therefore, they were forced to track everything. The computational load was crushing. The technical details of this cat-and-mouse escalation filled classified briefings and budget requests. However, the human element was simpler and darker. William Bell had betrayed his country's most sensitive intelligence capabilities. He received $110,000 for this, an amount roughly equal to $300,000 in 2025. He had done it without ideology or pressure. There was no significant planning involved. He acted simply because he wanted money, and the opportunity became available. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's behavioral analysis was part of the damage assessment. It concluded that Bell represented a specific vulnerability in the security clearance system. This vulnerability was the competent professional with no particular loyalty or ideological commitment. Traditional counterintelligence training focused on detecting foreign pressure, ideological radicalization, or personal crisis. Bell represented none of these factors. He was simply indifferent to anything beyond his immediate financial interests. The analysis recommended enhanced financial monitoring for cleared personnel. This recommendation would be implemented inconsistently and remain controversial. Mahar-Ian Zakharsky's case was different and more complex. As a career intelligence officer, his motivation was professional success within the Polish intelligence service. His recruitment and handling of Bell represented exceptional tradecraft. This included patient development, careful operational security, and effective financial incentivization. After his arrest, American counterintelligence specialists studied his methods. They used his case as a study in successful recruitment operations. The resulting classified training materials are still used by Central Intelligence Agency and FBI counterintelligence officers. These materials include transcripts of Zakharsky's conversations with Bell. They were reconstructed from FBI surveillance recordings. These serve as examples of how a skilled intelligence officer manipulates a target's rationalization process. The conversations revealed Zakharsky's technique. He never asked Bell directly for classified information. Instead, he expressed general interest in American aerospace technology. He mentioned that Polish industrial organizations would pay for technical consultations. Then, he let Bell make the logical leap. When Bell began offering classified materials, Zakharsky accepted them as if they were simply technical reports, not state secrets. The psychological effect was to normalize the betrayal. This made Bell feel like a well-compensated consultant rather than a spy. This approach had a name in intelligence training. It was called graying the moral boundary. If a target became uncertain about committing espionage, they would be less likely to experience psychological resistance. This resistance might otherwise prompt confession or withdrawal. Bell's post-arrest statements reflected this perfectly. He told FBI investigators that he initially believed he was merely sharing technical information. He had not realized this was illegal. The claim was legally absurd, as Bell had signed multiple security agreements and received annual counterintelligence briefings. However, it was psychologically revealing. Zakharsky had successfully convinced Bell to deceive himself. The turning point came not in a courtroom or a debriefing room. Instead, it happened in a frozen field outside Krasnoyarsk, Siberia. This occurred on March 14, 1983, at 4:22 a.m. local time. The 45ZH-6 KROH NAR space surveillance radar had been operational for 4 months. This system represented Soviet engineers' best attempt to operationalize the technical intelligence from the Bell compromise. It housed 800 tons of antenna arrays, cooling systems, and signal processing computers. The facility looked like a cathedral dedicated to Cold War paranoia. The system's mission was simple. It aimed to find American stealth satellites that American engineers believed were invisible. Senior Lieutenant O.H. Leg Maharkeen had the midwatch from midnight to 800. He was 26 years old and a graduate of the Mo-Zhai-Ski Military Space Academy. He was chronically bored by the routine of tracking orbital debris and cataloguing known satellites. The detection appeared at 4:22:17 during a routine scan of the orbital plane. This was at 37,000 kilometers altitude within geosynchronous orbit. American signals intelligence satellites typically operated there. The signature was wrong. It was not absent, but incorrect. A conventional satellite would have returned a sharp radar echo. However, this returned something that looked like scattered noise, yet it had a pattern. Maharkeen ran it through the correlation tracking algorithm. This algorithm had been derived from the Bell material. The system flagged it as a 93% probability match. It indicated a signals intelligence platform using signature management. MHR Keen did exactly what his training specified. He logged the detection, flagged it for command review, and continued scanning. At 8:15, when the day watch relieved him, he mentioned it to his replacement. By 1100, the detection report had reached the desk of Colonel General Anna Tochly Maksimov. He was the commander of Soviet space surveillance forces. By 1400, it was in Moscow, on the desk of Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff. The detection itself was significant, but not revolutionary. Soviet space tracking had been finding American satellites with increasing reliability since the new systems came online. What made this detection different was its timing and location. The satellite was in position to monitor Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile test launches from Plesetsk Cosmodrome. Plesetsk had a test scheduled for March the 17th, only 3 days away. This was a test of a new missile type that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization designated SSX-25. This missile was designed to be mobile and therefore difficult for American reconnaissance to track. Nikolai Ogarkov understood immediately what the detection meant. The Americans would be watching the test. They would observe launch procedures, track the missile's flight profile, and collect telemetry data. Everything the Soviet military hoped to keep secret about the SSX-25 would be compromised. A decision had to be made. The decision was made at 17:30 on March the 14th. They would postpone the test. It was not a cancellation, but a postponement. They would wait until the satellite's orbital mechanics carried it away from optimal observation position. Then they would conduct the test during the coverage gap. The decision cost approximately 12 million rubles in schedule delays and facility downtime. However, it protected the SSX-25's operational characteristics from American intelligence. The decision also did something else. It revealed that Soviet space surveillance capabilities had advanced beyond American assumptions. The National Reconnaissance Office, monitoring Soviet communications through signals intelligence, noticed the test postponement. Furthermore, CIA analysts reviewed the pattern of Soviet behavior. They concluded that Moscow had somehow detected the satellite's position and adjusted accordingly. The realization hit American intelligence with the force of strategic revelation. The damage from the Bell Compromise was not just that the Soviets had obtained technical specifications. It was that they had operationalized that information into effective countermeasures. The invisible satellites were no longer invisible. The human decision that changed everything belonged to a CIA analyst named Patricia Gardner. She worked in the Office of Strategic Research. Gardner had been tracking Soviet space program activities since 1979. She had read the damage assessment from the Bell case. Furthermore, she noticed something in the pattern of Soviet satellite tracking communications. It did not match the official assessment's predictions. The assessment had concluded that Soviet engineers would need at least 5 years to develop effective countermeasures. These were based on Bell's photographs. Gardner's analysis suggested they had accomplished this in 3 years. She wrote a memo, classified as top secret code word. This document was later partially declassified as CIARDP 85M0036-3R0004-0204000019. The memo argued that American satellite operations should assume Soviet tracking capabilities were significantly more advanced than previously assessed. The memo reached the desk of Robert Gates, then Deputy Director for Intelligence, in April 1983. Gates ordered a comprehensive review of Soviet space surveillance capabilities. The review took 6 months. It concluded that Gardner was correct. Soviet tracking systems could locate American stealth satellites with sufficient reliability. This allowed them to predict coverage windows and adjust military operations accordingly. The conclusion forced a fundamental revision in American satellite reconnaissance strategy. The National Reconnaissance Office began accelerating development of next-generation satellites. These new satellites featured advanced signature management. The CIA increased human intelligence collection targeting Soviet space tracking facilities. American military operations planners also began assuming that sensitive activities might be observable. This included periods when satellites were supposedly undetectable. The strategic shift had tactical consequences. In 1984, a planned B-2 stealth bomber test flight was relocated from Nevada to Alaska. This happened after intelligence assessments. These assessments concluded that Soviet satellites, now assumed to be highly capable, might observe the Nevada test range. In 1985, naval exercises in the North Atlantic were modified to assume Soviet satellite observation. The assumption of invisibility, which had shaped American military operations for a decade, was replaced by an assumption of persistent surveillance. However, the most significant consequence was psychological. The satellite reconnaissance community included engineers, intelligence officers, and military planners. They had believed that American technical superiority provided a decisive advantage. The Bell Compromise and its aftermath demonstrated that technical superiority was temporary and fragile. Soviet engineers, given the right information, could close capability gaps in years rather than decades. The psychological effect was a shift from confidence to vigilance, from assumption to verification. The shift played out in specific programs. The advanced KH-11 reconnaissance satellite was scheduled for deployment in 1986. It was redesigned with updated signature management techniques. The redesign cost $340 million. This also delayed deployment by 18 months. The Milstar communications constellation was still in early development. It received additional funding for enhanced encryption and anti-jamming capabilities. The National Reconnaissance Office also established a new office. This Office of Countermeasure Assessment was dedicated to evaluating how adversaries might exploit American satellite capabilities. Meanwhile, William Bell was in federal prison in Lompoc, California. He served his 8-year sentence in a medium-security facility. His daily routine involved working in the prison library, attending education programs, and writing letters to his ex-wife requesting money. He showed no particular remorse and no particular understanding of what he had done. In a 1985 interview with a prison psychologist, documented in his parole file, Bell stated that he felt his sentence was excessive. He believed that many people sold technical information to foreign companies. For him, it did not seem like a significant offense. The prison psychologist's assessment noted persistent moral detachment. It also identified an inability to recognize the severity of his offense. The assessment recommended against early release. Bell served 6 years of his 8-year sentence, earning time off for good behavior. He was released in 1988 to a witness protection program. His subsequent life remains unknown. The United States Marshal Service does not disclose witness protection placements. Marian Zacharski's fate was more visible and more politically significant. After his conviction in 1982, he was held at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. In 1985, he became part of a prisoner exchange. 4 Polish intelligence officers, including Zacharski, were traded for 25 Western agents held in Poland and East Germany. This exchange took place on June 11, 1985, at Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. This bridge was known as the Bridge of Spies from Cold War history. Zacharski returned to Warsaw as a hero. He was promoted to full colonel in Polish intelligence. He was awarded the Vir-2T Military Medal and given a senior position in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Years later, after the Cold War ended and Zacharski had retired, he gave interviews. He described the Bell operation as a prime example of successful recruitment. He expressed no regret. He died in 2022 in Poland at age 73. He had outlived both Bell's operational significance and the system he had served. The revelation came not from official disclosures. Instead, it came from technical failures that showed countermeasures in operation. This revealed how deeply the Bell compromise had affected American satellite operations. On September 12, 1987, a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, designated USA-27, experienced an issue. The National Reconnaissance Office initially classified this as a routine orbital anomaly. The satellite's ground control center at Sunnyvale, California, lost telemetry contact for 17 minutes. This occurred during a pass over Soviet territory. The loss of contact was not unprecedented. Satellites sometimes experience brief communication interruptions. These were due to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunctions. This interruption, however, had a pattern. The telemetry dropped exactly when the satellite crossed into Soviet airspace. It resumed exactly when it crossed out. This timing was too precise to be coincidental. Intelligence analysts concluded that Soviet ground stations had actively jammed the satellite's communications. This capability required knowing the satellite's exact position. It also required knowledge of its communications frequencies and transmission protocols. William Bell had compromised all of this information 6 years earlier. The jamming revelation forced a broader intelligence community assessment. If the Soviets could jam satellite communications, what else could they do? The assessment was conducted by a joint Central Intelligence Agency and National Reconnaissance Office team. It was completed in December 1987. This assessment concluded that Soviet space warfare capabilities had advanced substantially beyond official estimates. These capabilities included not just tracking and jamming. They also included potential anti-satellite weapons that could target specific platforms. This targeting was based on their known orbital parameters. The assessment's conclusions were briefed to President Ronald Reagan in January 1988. According to declassified meeting notes, Reagan expressed frustration. He believed the intelligence community had underestimated Soviet capabilities. He then ordered an accelerated program to develop countermeasures. This order resulted in several classified programs. These included enhanced satellite shielding, backup communication systems, and rapid replacement launch capabilities. However, the most significant revelation came from an unexpected source. It came from documents that emerged after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Russian intelligence services began declassifying Cold War materials. This was partially for historical transparency and partially for negotiating leverage. They released files on several successful intelligence operations. Among them was the case file on Marie-Anne Zacharski's recruitment and handling of William Bell. The file was released in 1996 and translated by Central Intelligence Agency analysts. It contained operational cables, damage assessments, and technical exploitation reports. The exploitation reports were stunning in their detail. Soviet engineers had not just used Bell's photographs to improve tracking systems, they had used them to redesign their entire space surveillance architecture. The 45ZH6 Chrono radar system was only the beginning. Bell's information had informed Soviet anti-satellite weapon development and communications jamming systems. It even influenced the design of Soviet military satellites. These incorporated signature management techniques directly copied from the American designs Bell had compromised. A 1983 KGB assessment was included in the released files. According to this assessment, the total value of the intelligence was approximately 200 million rubles in avoided research costs. This was roughly $280 million at contemporary exchange rates. The actual strategic value was, however, incalculable. Bell's photographs had given Soviet engineers a 10-year leap in capabilities. They would otherwise have developed these capabilities slowly and expensively through trial and error. The document releases also revealed something darker. Bell had been under KGB assessment since 1977. This was 3 years before Zacharski approached him. A Polish intelligence report from September 1977 identified Bell. It noted he was a Hughes aircraft employee with financial problems and access to satellite programs. The report recommended developmental recruitment. This involved patient cultivation until circumstances made him vulnerable to approach. Zacharski's close relationship with Bell had not been coincidental. It had been a carefully planned intelligence operation that took 3 years to execute. This revelation suggested a broader pattern. How many other defense contractors were under similar assessment? How many other Tsar-Ski-style recruitments were in progress? Were they waiting for the right moment? The Central Intelligence Agency's Counterintelligence Center conducted a comprehensive review. It examined defense contractor personnel with financial problems and significant access. The review was never publicly disclosed. However, it was referenced in congressional oversight documents. It identified over 3,000 individuals who matched the risk profile. Enhanced monitoring was implemented for approximately 400 of them. The document releases revealed another significant aspect: casualties. These were not deaths, as intelligence operations rarely kill people directly. Instead, careers ended and lives were disrupted. 3 Hughes aircraft engineers who had worked with Bell were forced to resign. This was due to security concerns, despite no evidence of wrongdoing. 2 Central Intelligence Agency officers had their operations in Poland compromised by Polish counterintelligence. This was possibly through connections to the Tsar-Ski case. These officers were withdrawn and reassigned. 6 Soviet engineers who had worked on space tracking programs were reportedly arrested by the KGB. They were suspected of leaking information to Western intelligence. This was a paranoid overreaction to the Americans' apparent knowledge of Soviet tracking capabilities. The human cost extended beyond professionals. Bell's ex-wife, who had divorced him in 1979, spent years dealing with Federal Bureau of Investigation interviews. She also faced media attention and the stigma of having been married to a convicted spy. Tsar-Ski's family in Poland faced similar scrutiny. This came from both Polish security services and Polish citizens. They viewed his espionage career with mixed feelings after the Cold War ended. The invisible casualties of intelligence operations, such as the families, colleagues, and bystanders, rarely appear in official accounts. Nevertheless, they accumulate. The official acknowledgement of the Bell case's full impact came in 1999. It occurred during congressional testimony by Central Intelligence Agency Director George Tenet. Testifying about counterintelligence failures, Tenet cited Bell as an example. He showed how a single compromised individual with significant access could cause strategic damage. Tenet's testimony included a previously classified assessment. The Bell compromise had required approximately $1.2 billion in countermeasure development and capability restoration. This was roughly 11,000 times what Bell had been paid for his betrayal. However, Tenet's testimony also included a more nuanced assessment. The compromise had forced American engineers to accelerate next-generation satellite development. That acceleration had resulted in new capabilities. These included advanced synthetic aperture radar and real-time signal processing. These might not have been deployed until years later without the pressure of the Bell compromise. The damage had been severe, but the response had been strategically valuable. This pattern of compromise driving innovation was characteristic of Cold War intelligence operations. The Walker family spy ring forced improvements in Navy communications security. The Year of the Spy in 1985 forced comprehensive counterintelligence reforms. The Bell case forced revolutionary advances in satellite technology. The arms race in secrets drove an arms race in capabilities. The question was whether the trade was worth it. The official assessments concluded that it was not. They found that the damage from compromises exceeded the value of the innovation they prompted. However, the calculations were necessarily speculative. How does one measure the value of a satellite program that was deployed 5 years earlier than planned? How does one quantify the strategic benefit of forcing Soviet engineers to waste resources on countermeasures? These were countermeasures that American engineers were already preparing to defeat. The ambiguity reflected a deeper truth about intelligence operations. Their effects cascade in ways that resist precise assessment. Bell's photographs changed satellite designs. This then changed Soviet tracking systems. It also changed American operational planning, which in turn changed Soviet military doctrine. This affected American defense budgets. The chain of consequences extended far beyond what either Bell or Tsar-Ski understood. This occurred when they met in a Los Angeles restaurant in 1979. The lasting impact of the Bell case played out across 3 dimensions. These were technical, operational, and cultural. Each dimension represented a different kind of strategic transformation. Technically, the case accelerated what intelligence historians would later call the 3rd generation of American reconnaissance satellites. The first generation, including Corona, Gambit, and Hexagon, had been film-based systems. They were designed for broad area surveillance. The second generation, such as early KH-11 platforms, had been digital imaging systems. These were designed for real-time observation. The third generation was developed in direct response to the Bell compromise. It integrated advanced signature management with electronic countermeasures, redundant communications, and rapid replacement capabilities. The signature management advances were particularly significant. Engineers at Lockheed's Advanced Development Programs Division, known as the Skunk Works, developed adaptive geometry satellites. The satellites could mechanically adjust their surface configurations in orbit. This changed their radar cross-section to defeat tracking systems. The technology was extraordinarily expensive. Each satellite cost approximately $2.1 billion in development and deployment, but it proved effective. Soviet tracking systems had learned to detect American satellites using Bell's compromised design principles. These systems suddenly found themselves blind again. The adaptive geometry satellites represented a broader principle called dynamic defense. Instead of designing static systems that could be analyzed and defeated, American engineers designed systems that could change their signatures. This was in response to adversary behavior. The principle extended beyond satellites. It also applied to stealth aircraft, submarine silencing technology, and communications encryption. The Bell Compromise had taught American defense planners that static superiority was temporary. Dynamic adaptability was permanent. Operationally, the case forced fundamental changes in how American intelligence agencies conducted satellite reconnaissance. The National Reconnaissance Office established new protocols for coverage uncertainty. This assumed that satellites might be detectable and missions might be observable. The protocols required backup collection plans, redundant satellite coverage, and alternative intelligence sources. The operational effect was reduced efficiency but increased resilience. American satellite reconnaissance became less elegant but harder to defeat. The protocols also included something called deception saturation. If Soviet space tracking systems could detect American satellites, American planners would give them too many targets to track effectively. The solution involved launching decoy satellites. These platforms looked like reconnaissance systems, but carried no actual sensors. Between 1985 and 1990, the National Reconnaissance Office launched approximately 30 decoys. These were mixed in with 15 actual reconnaissance satellites. Soviet tracking stations could not distinguish between real and fake targets without revealing their capabilities. The deception forced them to track everything. This wasted computational resources and analyst attention. The cultural impact was subtler but equally significant. The Bell case coincided with a broader crisis in American counterintelligence. 1985 became known as the Year of the Spy. During this time, 11 Americans were arrested for espionage. The cumulative effect was a shift in security culture from trust-based to verification-based systems. Defense contractors began implementing enhanced monitoring of cleared personnel. Polygraph examinations became more frequent and more rigorous. The concept of insider threat became central to counterintelligence doctrine. This idea suggested that cleared personnel could be the most dangerous security risks. The cultural shift had costs. Enhanced monitoring created an atmosphere of suspicion that talented engineers found oppressive. Polygraph examinations were psychologically stressful and of questionable reliability. The focus on insider threats sometimes distracted from external threats. These were the traditional espionage operations that counterintelligence was designed to defeat. However, the shift also prevented additional compromises. Several potential espionage cases were detected and disrupted in the late 1980s. This occurred through financial monitoring programs implemented in response to the Bell case. The most direct lasting impact was on Polish-American intelligence relations. The Zaha ski case severely damaged the relationship between American intelligence agencies and Poland's intelligence service. The damage persisted through the end of the Cold War and into the post-Soviet era. When Poland joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1999, American intelligence officials insisted on comprehensive counterintelligence briefings. These briefings concerned former officers like Zaha Ski, who had operated against Western targets. The briefings created tension. Polish officials viewed them as insulting and unnecessary. However, American officials viewed them as essential given the history of successful Polish operations against American interests. Zaha Ski himself became a controversial figure in post-Cold War Poland. Some viewed him as a patriot who had served his country effectively. Others viewed him as a relic of a discredited system. In interviews conducted in the 2000s, Zaharsky described his intelligence career with professional pride and no apparent regret. He characterized the Bell operation as good intelligence work and expressed satisfaction that his efforts had benefited Poland's security. Whether Poland's security had actually been enhanced by serving as a conduit for Soviet intelligence was a question he did not address. Bell's impact was more personal and less institutional. After his release from prison in 1988, he disappeared into witness protection and left no public record. His case file suggests he lived somewhere in the southwest under an assumed name. He worked in non-technical jobs that did not require security clearances. He died sometime in the early 2000s. The United States Marshal Service has never confirmed the details. His legacy exists only in classified files. It also appears in congressional testimony and counterintelligence training materials. These materials use his case as a cautionary example. The technological legacy extended into the modern era. The satellite signature management techniques that Bell compromised in 1980 evolved into the stealth technologies that defined 21st century military systems. The F-22 and F-35 fighter aircraft incorporate these principles. The B-2 and B-21 bombers also do. So do the Zoom Walt-class destroyers. All trace their lineage back to the signature management work Bell photographed at HYU's aircraft. The irony is that Bell's compromise forced American engineers to advance those principles. This was beyond what Soviet countermeasures could defeat. It ultimately strengthened American capabilities. The human legacy is more ambiguous. Bell demonstrated that motivated insider threats were extraordinarily difficult to detect before they caused damage. Enhanced security measures implemented after his case had mixed effectiveness. These included financial monitoring, polygraph examinations, and lifestyle audits. They detected some potential threats but also created false positives that disrupted innocent careers. The fundamental tension between operational security and individual privacy remained unresolved. The strategic legacy was a lesson about technological competition in intelligence operations. Superior technology provided temporary advantage, but adversaries with good intelligence could close capability gaps quickly. The only sustainable advantage was the capacity for continuous innovation. This involved developing new capabilities faster than adversaries could steal and exploit them. That capacity required massive investment, brilliant engineering, and institutional cultures that prioritized adaptation over preservation. In the specific case of satellite reconnaissance, the lesson was applied ruthlessly. American investment in space systems increased from approximately $8 billion annually in 1980. It grew to over $30 billion annually by 1990. The investment produced satellites with capabilities that would have seemed impossible in the early 1980s. These included synthetic aperture radar with sub-meter resolution. Signals intelligence platforms could intercept encrypted communications from orbit. Missile warning systems could also detect launches within seconds. The technological leap was expensive but decisive. By the time the Cold War ended in 1991, American satellite reconnaissance capabilities were once again a generation ahead. They surpassed Soviet capabilities. The financial cost of that achievement was measured in budget documents. The strategic cost was measured in opportunities forgone. These included domestic programs underfunded and social investments delayed. The human cost was measured in careers disrupted by security investigations. Lives were lived under suspicion. Whether those costs were justified depends on whether the Cold War's peaceful conclusion was worth what it cost to achieve. The question remains contentious. The document was filed in a safe at the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia. This was not a document about William Bell. Those documents filled multiple filing cabinets. Instead, it was a document written by William Bell. This single sheet of paper was recovered from his personal effects after his arrest. It contained a handwritten calculation. The calculation attempted to determine how much money Bell would need to achieve what he called financial stability. The number at the bottom was $250,000. Below it, Bell had written that 2 years of consulting would equal stability. The word consulting was underlined twice. The document was classified secret, not for its content, but for its context. It represented the internal logic of a man. This man had convinced himself that photographing his country's most sensitive satellite programs was equivalent to consulting. The document was used in counterintelligence training. It illustrated how espionage subjects rationalized their betrayals and constructed frameworks where treason became just another business opportunity. But the document also represented something the training materials did not emphasize. Bell's calculation was wrong. At $110,000, roughly half his target, he had been caught, convicted, and imprisoned. His consulting had earned him 6 years in federal prison and a lifetime of anonymity in witness protection. Financial stability remained permanently out of reach. The safe containing the document was opened occasionally. This occurred when new counterintelligence officers attended training and needed to see primary source materials. The officers would examine the calculation, note its cold, mercenary logic, and return it to the safe. The document remained classified through the Cold War's end. It continued through the declassification waves of the 1990s and 2000s. It remains classified through the present day. This was not because it contained technical secrets or operational details. Rather, it represented a kind of truth that security systems preferred to keep hidden. This included the banality of betrayal and the ordinary arithmetic of extraordinary damage. Outside the safe, in the corridors and offices of Langley, the satellite reconnaissance mission continued. New satellites launched on classified schedules. They carried sensors built by engineers who had never heard of William Bell. Those engineers worked under security protocols implemented in response to Bell's betrayal. Systems designed to detect Bell-type threats monitored them. They were briefed on counterintelligence cases where Bell's name appeared without context. It served as just another cautionary example in the long history of insider threats. The satellites they built were invisible again. This was not because Soviet tracking systems had been defeated permanently. It was because American engineers had stayed ahead of the countermeasures that Bell's compromise had enabled. The invisibility was temporary. It was maintained through continuous innovation, constant vigilance, and billions of dollars in annual investment. It was an expensive way to maintain an advantage. This advantage could be compromised by a single engineer with a camera and a rationalizing mind. However, it was the only way that worked. The history of the Cold War's intelligence competition was a history of compromises and countermeasures. Each drove the other forward in a spiral of technological escalation. Bell's photographs had accelerated one turn of that spiral. The response, billions invested in next-generation capabilities, had accelerated another turn. The pattern would continue long after both Bell and the Cold War had passed into history. In 2022, a journalist researching Cold War espionage cases requested declassification of Bell's handwritten calculation. This was done through a Freedom of Information Act filing. The request was denied. The denial stated that the document remained classified under exemptions related to intelligence sources and methods. The real reason remained unspoken. The document was psychologically revealing in ways that technical specifications were not. The safe remained locked. The calculation remained hidden. And somewhere in the southwest, in an unmarked grave under an assumed name, William Bell remained anonymous. He was remembered not as an individual, but as a case study. He was a cautionary tale and a warning about what happens when access meets opportunity and conscience fails. The only monument to his existence was the technology he forced into existence. These were the invisible satellites still orbiting overhead, watching everything and seen by no one. They were defended against the countermeasures his betrayal had enabled. The ultimate irony was that his crime had made the target stronger. But that irony, like the calculation, remained classified.